Greetings. Thank you for joining Reporting in Chris, Abuse, Neglect, and Human Rights Complaints. This is an Office of Human Rights training presentation. This training was developed to explore the functions of CRIS, to draw parallels between CRIS and the human rights regulations, and also to provide clarity to some common questions that we have from providers. This presentation will cover some definitions. We'll review those regulatory requirements. We'll also talk just a little bit about establishing CRIS accounts. Most of the training today will be focused on navigating through CRIS. Then we'll go over some frequently asked questions, review some practical applications, and then I'll close out with some reminders and tips for you guys so that you can be successful as you navigate through CRIS. So, there's a friendly debate within the Office of Human Rights over what the C in CRIS stands for. Is it comprehensive or computerized? The HRS is easier. It stands for Human Rights Information System. So as long as you know it's either comprehensive or computerized Human Rights Information System, then you are good to go. CRIS is the official reporting repository for all human rights complaints as identified in the Human Rights Regulations, otherwise known as the web-based reporting system. The system allows for your human rights advocate to ensure your compliance with the human rights complaint process and regulatory reporting. Not only is the system used by the Office of Human Rights, but the Office of Licensing as well. If you have any questions or concerns, though, regarding expectations from the Office of Licensing, please contact your licensing specialist. So now let's delve into some definitions. The definition of abuse is complex in that two parts must be satisfied in order for abuse to have occurred. In considering whether abuse occurred, perform what we call a two-pronged test. First, determine whether the act or failure to act by the employee was done so knowingly, recklessly, or intentionally. So let's talk about what these words mean. Knowingly simply means being done with a sense of consciousness or awareness. Recklessly refers to being done with a sense of carelessness, with inattention or deviation from the policies and procedures. If something is done intentionally, that means that it was done deliberately or willfully. So the second part to the two-pronged test is that the act or failure to act by an employee either caused or may have caused physical or psychological harm, injury, or death. What is important about abuse and the other definitions that we'll cover a bit later is that they are not subjective. You have the regulatory definition to aid you as you investigate and prepare your recommendations for findings. As you'll see a bit later, abuse is separated into several categories. We have physical, sexual, verbal, and excessive force, or as it's identified in CRIS, by seclusion and restraint. Some common examples of abuse include rape and sexual assault, assault and battery, demeaning, threatening, intimidating, or humiliating language, or excessive force when implementing physical or mechanical restraints. Another example and category of abuse that is often overlooked or may be often overlooked or just not fully realized is exploitation. Be mindful that exploitation is not just relevant to financial misconduct on the part of an employee. It also refers to an employee's use as an authority figure to intimidate or bully an individual to get a certain result. Some examples of exploitation include using an individual's belongings without their permission, withholding an individual's belongings to ensure compliance with a request, encouraging an individual to make a purchase with their own money for something that you, the employee, wants, and also accepting gifts. What's important to understand about neglect is that it is a failure to abide by policy and procedure, the treatment or behavioral plan, or a denial of an individual's basic right to dignity that places that individual at risk of being unhealthy or unsafe. Whether neglect occurred may seem somewhat of a sticky situation. However, it is rather simple. Ask yourself questions such as, did staff do what was supposed to be done in the manner that it should have been done? And also, what do the internal policies and procedures mandate? Some examples of neglect include failure to take actions that would have prevented an injury, failure to stop or try to stop an individual from an activity that could lead to harm, failure to report a coworker for not doing their job, or failure to report any inappropriate activity between individuals or staff. And then a common example of neglect is allowing two individuals to fight without intervening. It is important to understand that an allegation is not a conclusion of guilt. It is an assertion of possible wrongdoing. Therefore, an investigation must be conducted to determine whether there is a preponderance of evidence to support the allegation or not. You must be diligent in recognizing these factors that may appear to be abusive, neglectful, or exploitive, and report those factors or report those allegations to the Office of Human Rights via CRIS within 24 hours of awareness of that allegation. Any person who is tasked with conducting an investigation of abuse or neglect must be trained to do so. And evidence of that training must be documented in the trainer's personnel record. Additionally, any person who is the subject of an investigation, despite whether or not they are trained to conduct that investigation, may not investigate that particular allegation. The regulations stipulate that all investigations should begin as soon as possible. However, investigations must begin no later than the next business day following receipt of the allegation. The director is the custodian of the investigation. They finalize the investigator's recommendations and any applicable action plan. It is the director's responsibility to inform the individual and that individual's AR, if in fact there is one, of the provider's final decision and applicable action plan, and their right to appeal, and the process to appeal the decision or action plan. This must be done in writing and within 10 working days of the results of the investigation being submitted. Complaints of violations against an insured right is no less important than complaints involving abuse or neglect. The only difference is the time frames you are responsible for. To avoid non-compliance with late reporting, all complaints against assured rights must be reported to the Office of Human Rights no later than the next business day after receipt of the complaint. You must make contact with the individual who is the subject of the complaint regarding the complaint within 24 hours of receipt of that complaint. As with complaints involving abuse or neglect, the investigation must begin no later than the next business day. The major difference here is that investigators of complaints against assured rights are not required to be trained. It is important, however, that there are policies and procedures in place outlining your investigative procedures. As always, the director is the final decision maker. So, specific to complaints involving abuse and neglect, 12 VAC 35-115-230 of the Human Rights Regulations documents specific actions for provider reporting. As previously stated, all allegations of abuse and neglect must be reported to the Office of Human Rights via CRIS within 24 hours of receipt of that allegation. Please be advised, all complaints must be reported within the specified time frame, regardless of a weekend or holiday. So, for example, let's say a report of abuse or neglect was received on Friday evening at 7 o'clock p.m. That allegation must be entered in CRIS by 7 o'clock p.m. that following day, which would be on a Saturday. Also, 12 VAC 35-115-175, the human rights complaint process, mandates that investigators of abuse and neglect be trained to conduct such investigations. For your information, the Office of Human Rights has resources available on the DBHDS website specific to community investigations. As with initial reporting timeframes, there are timeframes for beginning and concluding an investigation. Investigations of abuse and neglect must begin as soon as possible, but no later than the next business day. The trained investigator then has 10 business days to complete the investigation. Should circumstances arise that prevent the investigator from finishing the investigation on time, the provider may in fact request an extension from the Office of Human Rights or the advocate who is working that particular CRIS case. Extensions will be considered and granted by the advocate. However, extension requests should be made no later than the 6th day and be for a valid reason. For example, being unable to interview the accused staff. Please be mindful to report any serious injury or death that may be the result of abuse or neglect to the Office of Human Rights within those specified time frames as well. All requests for Delta accounts to include obtaining access to CRIS must be made through the Delta Help Desk. You are strongly encouraged to email the Help Desk for the quickest response, and this provides you a paper trail of all requests. However, you may also call the Help Desk if you so desire at 804-887-7403 or 887-7402. Each agency should have at least 2 representatives who are in a leadership position assigned Delta oversight. This is just a recommendation, not a mandate, only a recommendation. Depending on the size of the agency, it may be a good idea to consider even more staff with Delta privileges. These representatives will oversee CRIS operations and the roles assigned to the agency's representatives. There should always be staff available to enter complaints and available to access the report when and if necessary. If you're having any problems with your Delta login, here on the Delta sign-in page on the left navigation menu is the help button. You can always click this link to find PDFs and also training videos that will help navigate you through the Delta sign-on process. Also, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see again the contact information for Delta. The Delta prod at dbhds.virginia.gov is the best email or the best way or method to contact Delta Help Desk. Just to provide you some friendly advice, passwords for Chris, they do expire every 90 days. And with that, you cannot reuse the last 24 passwords. If your password does expire, you may either email the Delta Help Desk at deltaprod@dbhds.virginia.gov or your agency's Delta security officer. So once you've successfully accessed the Chris platform through Delta, you'll be redirected to this Chris login screen. After clicking on Chris, you will enter your username and your password, which was obtained through Delta. Chris has the functionality to search for a case by individual name or abuse or complaint number. If an individual is known to have been entered in Chris, but the individual is unable to be found by entering their name, try searching by adding one space before the first name. So hitting the space bar one time and then re-entering that individual's name. Be mindful though, when entering an individual into Chris for the first time, do not put a space before their name. Also, do not create multiple entries for the same individual. Chris numbers are 8 digits beginning with the year of the incident, so for example, 2021, and ending with the sequential order of the incident. So the first incident for your agency, if it was in the year 2021, would be 20210001. Now let's talk about entering a new case. Anytime a new complaint needs to be entered, whether a complaint involving abuse or neglect or a complaint of a violation of assured rights, you have to start by selecting by name. Once the victim's name is entered, as discussed on the previous slide, if the individual has had previous complaints entered, that individual's profile will be returned and you can simply click on the name and start entering the necessary data. If this is the individual's first complaint though, you will need to enter all necessary information to build the individual's profile, and we'll go over that in just a second. All complaints are entered for the victim. So anytime you are entering an allegation, it is for the victim of that alleged incident. Before specific complaint information can be entered for an individual who has never had a complaint entered previously, community providers such as CSBs and other private providers must enter the demographic data for that particular individual who is the victim. As you see, all required fields are marked. You will only have to enter this information one time. Of course, if information changes, so for example, if an individual moves to another home within your organization, please make sure to update the information here. This is the second half of the demographics page. Although it is not marked as being required fields, providers are asked to indicate whether or not the individual has a substitute decision maker. The substitute decision maker would consist of an authorized representative or a legal guardian. If the individual has a substitute decision maker, please select yes. Then enter the name of that person and the relationship of that person to the individual. Advocates review this page to determine compliance with reporting. So it is one of 3 places in CRIS where identification of or notification to the authorized representative or substitute decision maker is needed. And I'll point out the other sections as we move through the training. Make sure to click Save after you have entered the necessary information on this page. Then you'll click Continue to move through the remainder of the CRIS entry. An important note moving forward, click Save often. CRIS will lock you out after 15 minutes and delete any unsaved information. So either ensure you are able to enter all necessary information and click Save, or maintain a Word document with all necessary information so if you are locked out and your information is erased, you can easily copy and paste information back into the required fields. After ensuring the demographic information is entered and you have properly identified whether the individual has a substitute decision maker, you'll be directed to the Allegation tab. You will find the title of each tab at the top of the CRIS screen. The Allegation tab is where you will enter information relevant to the allegation. Once on this page, click here to add a new incident. If this is not the first time an incident is being reported for the individual, you will see all other incidents listed on this page with their corresponding CRIS number or counter number as is identified here in CRIS. All sections of CRIS should be completed. There are certain sections, however, that are marked with red asterisks that must be completed or CRIS will not save the report. So these sections include the abuse date, which is the date the alleged abuse occurred. If you do not know this date, please put the date the abuse was discovered. The location is another required field, and this is the provider's specific line of service where the alleged abuse occurred. So for example, DD Group Home Service or Supervised Living, etc. Use the drop-down menu to select the location and then use the Get Address button to select the street address of the location. Another required field is the FIPS category. This is the Federal Information Processing Standards Code that DBHDS must use for reporting purposes. Use the drop-down menu to select your location's code by county or city name. Please make sure to select the correct FIPS code. If the wrong code is selected, the report will go to the wrong region and disrupt the complaint resolution process. You'll then be required to enter the specific site of abuse. This is the place where the alleged abuse occurred. So for example, in the kitchen or at McDonald's while you all were out on an outing. The next required field is for waiver. Is the individual receiving services on a waiver? You will simply select yes or no. If the answer is yes, then the 2 next fields must be completed. That is the waiver type and also the case management provider. Lastly, you'll enter the individual's Medicaid number. Continuing on, the allegation tab is where the meat of the complaint is going to be documented. Under details, you'll need to identify the type of abuse or neglect being alleged. It is important to note that all of these allegation types are against staff. By selecting physical and verbal, the provider is stating that an individual receiving services made an allegation of physical and verbal abuse against a staff person or staff persons. Checking neglect peer to peer indicates that while there was an incident involving two or more individuals receiving services, so two or more peers, there is an allegation that the assigned employee or employees either did not provide adequate supervision or, according to the provider's internal policies and procedures, did not prevent or appropriately intervene during the peer to peer incident. Checking neglect non peer to peer indicates the employee failed to provide a service or, in providing that service, did not provide it efficiently, effectively, or within sound therapeutic practices. So, examples of neglect non peer to peer would include allegations such as medication errors or incidents of elopement. Only a small population of licensed providers are able to use seclusion. And for details and regulatory requirements on seclusion and restraint, please review 12 Act 35-115-110 of the Human Rights Regulations. For those providers that are able to utilize seclusion, or those providers needing to report an allegation of excessive force, the seclusion restraint type should be checked. You will then need to select the appropriate option from the type of restraint drop-down menu. Excessive use of force in implementing, unnecessary use of seclusion or restraint, or not in compliance with standards are the options in that drop-down menu. Please note, any instance of seclusion or restraint that does not comply with the chapter of the Human Rights Regulations or approved variances, or that results in injury to an individual, must be reported to the authorized representative and to the department, meaning the Office of Human Rights, via CRIS, within 24 hours. The other type should not be used. If you believe there is no other appropriate allegation type, please contact your regional advocate to discuss the matter. The description of the abuse should be a well-written, clear, and concise overview of the allegation. It should justify the type or types of allegations that you have checked. This description does not need to be and should not be a novel, though. The injury section documents whether or not the individual was injured. If the individual was not injured, select no, and then you can move on to the next section. However, if there was an injury, select yes, and then complete the remainder of the section in its entirety. The last section on the allegation tab is to document who made the allegation, to whom did that person report the allegation, who reported the allegation to the director, is the last field that would need to be completed. Finally, it's important for the Office of Human Rights to have the information of the person who entered the CRIS data. In the event that the Office of Human Rights staff have questions regarding information entered in CRIS, this will be the point of contact. So, congratulations, you have made it through the first part of entering your first CRIS report. Make sure, click save, and now we can move on to the next section. The notification tab is where you will document the dates and the times of all the people you are required to notify and those you may need to notify. The date and time that the director was notified, that will be automatically filled in based on the information that you entered in the reporting section on the allegation tab. The date and time for the DBHDS advocate will also automatically populate according to the date and time you are entering the CRIS report. The Office of Human Rights reviews these dates to ensure your compliance with regulatory reporting timeframes. It is important to document the date and time you notified the substitute decision maker or AR of the allegation. Per 12 Back 35 115 175 of the Human Rights Regulations, the AR must be notified within 24 hours of receipt of an allegation of abuse or neglect. This is the second section in which advocates review to determine whether there is in fact a substitute decision maker or AR. Remember, the first section is on the individual tab under the demographic information. Remember that all helping professionals are mandated reporters. Therefore, the appropriate protection agency, whether it be APS or CPS, should be notified of all allegations of abuse or neglect, and the name, date, time, method of notification should be documented under the DSS section here on the notification tab. For any allegation that is criminal in nature, the appropriate police authority must be contacted. Ensure to complete the corresponding section for contact with either the local or state police. And now that you have finished entering data on the notification tab, remember, click Save. The name of the accused employee is an important piece of information. That employee's name needs to be entered here on the accusation tab. Remember, the accused, as it relates to reporting of abuse and neglect, is the employee or employees. At the time a CRIS report is entered, if the name of the accused employee is known, enter the name and the position and click Save. If the accused is not known at the time of entry, document unknown in the last name field, select an appropriate position from the drop-down menu, and click Save. At the time the investigation is finalized or when the information first becomes available, ensure that the accusation tab is updated with the accused employee's name and any actions taken. If other is selected as an action taken, document what that other is in the remarks box that is labeled Other. Remember, click Save. Please note that guidance concerning the OHR's authority to request the accused employee's name may be found under the Help section in CRIS. And after we review the pages in CRIS, I will show you all how to get to that Help section. Perhaps the most simple of all the tabs in CRIS is this Witnesses tab. Here's where you will document all persons involved in the incident and all persons interviewed as part of the investigation. Best practice is to always interview the individual if able and appropriate. And again, after you have entered all of the information that you need to enter, click Save. While all the tabs in CRIS and all aspects of the reporting process are important, the investigation tab requires some special attention. With all the other tabs, as you move through the information, you may click Save and CRIS will save the information entered, whether all the information on that tab is entered or not. This is not so for the investigation tab. To ensure compliance with regulatory reporting and to avoid the risk of a citation for late reporting, make sure to enter the date and time the investigation began, along with the investigator's name at the time that the allegation is first entered, and click Save. Do not enter any other information at this time unless you are prepared to complete this page in its entirety. If you enter any other information besides the date, time, and investigator's name and click Save, Chris will delete your data. When you are prepared to enter your investigative findings, return to this Investigations tab and complete it. 12 Act 35-115-230 of the Human Rights Regulations stipulates that the investigation must begin as soon as possible, but no later than the next business day. Also, the investigation must be completed within 10 business days. Again, this excludes holidays and weekends. If there is a legitimate reason the investigation will not be completed within 10 days, you may request an extension through the assigned advocate. And as we stated previously, all extensions should be requested no later than by day 6. So let's move through the fields on this investigation tab. Date of investigator's final report is the date that the trained investigator submitted the investigation summary to the director for review, which includes the investigator's recommendations for findings. The director, again, as we've stated, will make the final decision on those findings. What type of abuse occurred refers to the allegation types that were investigated. This should match what is on the allegation tab. Also, if there were allegation types identified through the investigation which may not have been initially reported, you will identify that here as well. Check yes for a substantiated finding or no for an unsubstantiated finding. Only make a selection for those allegation types investigated. In this example, physical and verbal abuse were initially reported, and that is what was investigated. Therefore, only yes or no should be indicated for each of those allegation types. Leave all of the other allegation types blank. Continuing on the investigation tab, after identifying whether the allegation is substantiated or unsubstantiated, you must document the rationale. So check the appropriate rationale for the decision. If you select other, you must provide a description of that rationale in the other rationale text box. Next, you'll document the decision date. Now, this is the date that the director finalizes the decision to either substantiate or unsubstantiate the allegation. You'll then document the reason for corrective action. In this section, check all of the appropriate reasons for corrective action. If the allegation is substantiated, there must be an identified reason for corrective action. If either performance issue or systemic issue is checked as substantiated, it stands to reason that the overall finding would be substantiated. So at this point, you've almost completed the investigation tab. After documenting the reason for the corrective action, you're then going to document the corrective actions that have been taken or that will be taken. In this section, you're going to check all of the appropriate corrective actions taken. If the allegation is substantiated, there must be an identified corrective action taken. Pay special attention to appropriate staff action taken. Appropriate staff action taken refers to the appropriate corrective action that has been implemented by the provider for a particular staff. This does not mean that the staff acted appropriately. If this corrective action taken radio button is selected, you must document what the corrective action taken was in the corresponding appropriate staff action taken description text box. You'll follow this same procedure if you select appropriate notification to Office of Licensing. Next, you're going to document the notification of decision and right to appeal. These are the dates that the provider notified the individual and AR, if in fact there is one, of the findings, the applicable action plan, and their right under the human rights regulations to appeal the director's decision and or action plan. The appeal notification must be presented to the individual and the AR in writing. The notification must also include the regional manager's name and contact information. The date entered for the DBHDS advocate may or may not be the same as the dates entered for the individual or substitute decision maker. The remainder of the investigation tab is fairly simple and does not require much action on your part. The assigned advocate will enter their name when the report is first assigned to them. Under case status, the provider is responsible for selecting the point of resolution and the individual decision from the appropriate drop-down menus. The point of resolution at minimum must be at the director level. The advocate will select the appropriate status and enter the date the case is closed. The advocate will also enter their name in the closed by section. The provider is not able to close a report, only the advocate is able to do that. Now that all of this required information has been entered, you can finally click Save. An important note, I just want to review some things that we've talked about as it relates to the Investigation tab. The Investigation tab will not save if required information is missing. So follow these steps. Initially, enter only the investigation begin date, begin time, and investigator's name, and click Save. Once you are prepared to enter the findings, come back to the Investigation tab and complete the remainder of that page. If you attempt to enter information and skip any of the required steps, Chris will not save this page. Once the Investigation tab is saved, and this goes for all of the other tabs and Chris as well, you will see the record is saved in green or maybe in red at the top and bottom of your screen. This is the only way to ensure your information is saved. If you do not see this message, if you do not see the words, "the record is saved," Chris will provide you an error message. Correct the error, then click Save again, and ensure you see the record is saved. One of the final tabs is the advocate report. This tab is the responsibility of the advocate to complete. All work that the advocate completes related to the particular complaint will be documented here. You as a provider are encouraged to review the advocate report for specific questions or follow-up that may be requested by members of the Office of Human Rights. So we made it through entering a complaint involving abuse and neglect. Now let's work through entering a complaint concerning violations of assured rights. The concept is very similar with just a few distinct differences. Remember, if this is the first report for the individual, you will need to complete all of the demographic information, including whether there is a substitute decision maker. Instead of an allegation tab here in this part of Chris, you will be directed to the complaint tab after entering the required demographic information. Just like on the allegation tab though, ensure all the required information is entered here. All of the fields marked with an asterisk. Make sure, just like on the abuse page, the allegation page, make sure to enter the correct FIPS code to ensure the report makes it to the correct region. The most notable difference between abuse and neglect and assured rights complaints is seen here. So instead of identifying a type of abuse or neglect, You'll have to identify the specific regulation or assured right and the subcategory of the regulation that is alleged to have been violated from the respective drop down menus. You will need to rely on the human rights regulations to ensure you have identified the correct regulation and subcategory based on the complaint. Of course, though, if you have any questions, the assigned advocate is more than happy to assist you. In this example, the individual made a complaint that they were unable to keep their personal property. So the provider selected the appropriate regulation concerning this matter, which in this case is section 20 and 40 of the human rights regulations, and the most appropriate subcategory being property. As with complaints involving abuse and neglect, you'll need to document the necessary reporting information. So who made the complaint, to whom did they report it, who reported it to the director, and also the name and number of the person entering the data into CRIS. Finally, you're going to click Save. As with complaints involving abuse and neglect, the name of the accused employee is an important piece of information. That employee's name needs to be entered here on the accusation tag. Remember, the accused is the employee. Note that you do not have to document actions taken here. Remember, click Save. As I mentioned previously, just want to remind you that there is guidance concerning the Office of Human Rights Authority to request this information, and we'll go over that once we get to the help section of CRIS. Remember, any person witness to the incident or interviewed as part of the investigation needs to be listed here to include the individual when and if available. As always, after you have finished entering the information, you must click Save. The other most notable change between abuse and neglect and assured rights complaints is this findings tab. So similar to the investigation tab, you will still need to document the outcome of the investigation. Instead of substantiated or unsubstantiated though, you will document whether there was a violation found or no violation found. Others should not be selected. If there is a question regarding the investigation, please contact the assigned advocate for assistance. Typically, the Office of Human Rights will not close a report with a finding of other. As you see, the graphics to the right of this slide show you the options in the drop-down menus. Remember, point of resolution should always be at the director's level at minimum. For the resolution, select the most appropriate option based on the investigative findings. As you see by the asterisks, a description of the resolution is required. This is where you should document a clear and concise explanation of how the complaint was resolved. As you continue to complete the findings tab, you will notice that the remainder is very similar to the investigation tab. The difference here is that you have to document the date the resolution was accepted or declined by the individual and any pertinent and relevant comments about attempts to know the individual and or the authorized representative. You'll see there is a box to check if you were unable to notify the individual or AR. Notification of findings, though, is not optional. Attempts to notify the individual and AR should be fully exhausted. As you are required to notify the individual and AR of their right to appeal in writing, a suggestion is to send the letter certified so that you have evidence that notification was attempted. After completing this tab, up until this point, you're able to go ahead and click Save. As discussed previously, here the advocate will document all work related to the particular CRIS case. This slide is almost identical to that in the abuse and neglect side. CRIS allows you the option to generate several different types of reports. Reports allow you to keep track of all types of information. So, for example, open cases, number of cases entered for a specific period, types of abuse cases, etc. So, from the left menu, the left navigation menu, you will click the type of report to run, whether it's abuse, complaint, serious injury, or death. For all reports, complete the selection parameters, and then you'll be able to preview the report. This page should look familiar as it's the first page you come to after entering CRIS. What was not shown previously in this presentation was this left side navigation menu bar. Most important to you here is the help section that I've been talking about throughout the presentation, and it is at the very bottom of this left side navigation bar. Please take time to explore the resources available here. You will find the guidance referenced previously relating to the Office of Human Rights Authority to request the accused employee's name. You will find a full and complete comprehensive navigating CRIS manual that takes you step by step. And you'll also find guidance documents for entering abuse and neglect and assured rights complaints. So after selecting help, you'll land here. Again, this page contains so much information that it's helpful to you, and it should be your first stop if and when you have a question about CRIS. Full disclaimer, it is a work in progress, but we are working to ensure this page stays updated as new information is released or if processes change. The links highlighted or circled rather in yellow are specific to the Office of Human Rights. Note here that you can also find Office of Licensing specific information on this page. But as always, as we encourage you to do, if there's a question regarding something specific to the Office of Licensing, please contact your licensing specialist. I doubt any of us will ever have this problem, but in the event you work through CRIS so quickly before it times you out, remember to log out after you have finished. This repository contains very sensitive information, and you would not want unauthorized persons accessing the system. So, now time for some frequently asked questions. Is it possible for two providers to enter the same complaint or abuse allegation? Yes. So as an example, if an individual who receives day support services and group home services is found to have bruises on their body by day support staff, but that individual can't tell the day support staff what happened, the day support provider would report the incident and investigate. The group home where the individual resides should also report and investigate. So what about medication errors? Are they reportable as allegations of neglect? Yes, in fact, they are. So the following types of errors may be reportable to the Office of Human Rights as potential neglect if it results or has the potential to result in a serious injury, or if the individual or AR makes a complaint. So again, these errors may be reportable as potential neglect if it results in or has the potential to result in a serious injury, or if the individual or AR makes a complaint. administration of the wrong dose, the wrong medication, the wrong person, or if the medication error was the result of multiple doses of medication not being administered, or there were discontinued medications that were still being administered. As always, if you have questions, you may contact the assigned advocate or your assigned regional advocate for clarification. So when a peer-to-peer incident's reported, generally providers do not report threats where there is no visible means for the individual to carry out their actions. There could, however, be a situation that could lead to a very serious act of aggression from a mere threat. We ask the provider to look into each of these activities and take the appropriate actions internally to ensure the safety of each of the individuals involved. Should the provider determine through the internal investigation that there has been neglect on the part of the staff, then they are asked to contact the Office of Human Rights and provide the follow-up information deemed appropriate. An example for a non-reportable peer-to-peer is, let's say there was a staff that was sitting with clients during a therapeutic activity and one peer slapped another peer. But it does not necessarily this does not have to necessarily be entered into CRIS as negligence because the staff was there and intervened immediately and appropriately by separating the individuals and ensuring each of their safety. So just to continue on with some peer-to-peer FAQs, pushing and shoving is generally not reported. But again, as I mentioned, if it was made for the victim to feel threatened or intimidated by the aggressor, then it may need to be reported. These things, we understand, are very subjective, and we are here in the Office of Human Rights to discuss these with you and to provide guidance as to whether or not it should be reported. But keep in mind your reporting mandates, your reporting timeframes. Unless an individual is known to have some type of communicable disease and they are utilizing their bodily fluids to inflict harm on another person, then incidents of spitting are not routinely reported to the Office of Human Rights. If there is an issue with your organization's address not being listed in CRIS properly, or not in one of the mandatory fields, then you will need to get in contact with the Office of Licensing as they manage that particular system. All right, now let's work through some practical applications. We're going to start here with the case of Mary. So Mary has been receiving services through her group home for just over a year and has no history of elopement. The group home's internal protocol is that all individuals receive eyes-on supervision every 30 minutes. At 1 o'clock p.m., Mary tells staff that she is going to go sit on the front porch. Must have been a beautiful day. At 1:15, staff checked the front porch and Mary was not there. Staff walked around the house and called out for Mary, but they did not see her. At 1:28, Mary reappeared by walking back inside and informed staff that it was a nice day and she decided to take a brief walk. Does this need to be reported in CRIS? No. And why does it not? Mary does not have an increased supervision plan that we know of. We're going to assume that. And she does not have a history of elopement. Also, staff had eyes on supervision with Mary at 1 o'clock and again at 1:28. So for the internal protocol, that was within the 30-minute eyes on supervision policy. So therefore, there's no need to report this incident into Chris. Now, there may be some other things to consider, like are there any known risk factors? Now that it was believed that Mary has eloped, should there be a team meeting to update any treatment plans? And what would have been the policy if during the time that Mary was not visible to staff, what if a serious incident had occurred? What would have been the policy of the provider to handle that type of situation? So even though this incident does not need to be reported, there are things to consider in continuing to ensure Mary's health and safety. So Sonia has been receiving services through her group home for 3 weeks. She has no history of elopement from any previous service providers. At about 11:15, while she was on her community outing to a local shopping center, Sonia informed her staff that she needed to use the restroom. When Sonia had not returned, 10 minutes later, staff checked the restroom and did not find Sonia anywhere. Staff immediately notified Sonia's case manager, Sonia's guardian, and the services director before continuing to look for Sonia. According to the provider's internal policy, staff must have eyes on supervision every 30 minutes. After 30 minutes of searching, staff could not find Sonia and notified local law enforcement in accordance with the agency's internal policy. While staff was on the phone with law enforcement at 12 o'clock p.m., Sonia emerged from another store with a shopping bag in her hand and told staff that she had forgotten to purchase a few needed items and went back to the store to get them. Does this need to be reported in Chris? Yes, it does. So here, based on the description of the incident, we know that the internal policy requires eyes on supervision every 30 minutes. Being as though Sonia was not within eyesight for 45 minutes, then this would need to be reported because there was a deviation from the provider's internal policies. Now, something to consider is that the provider may want to consider updating Sonia's individualized treatment plan to allow her extra unsupervised time if, in fact, Sonia is able to handle that. Again, we want to make sure that we're ensuring her health and safety at all times. So let's talk about a med error. During the scheduled med pass, employee 1 was prepared to administer individual number 1's mood stabilizer, an anticonvulsant, and antibiotic. At that time, employee 1 became distracted by an altercation between other individuals in the home. After employee 1 responded to and de-escalated the altercation, employee 1 continued med passes but did not administer meds to individual number 1. The error was discovered the following day and reported to the supervisor. Does this need to be reported in Chris as potential neglect? Yes, it does. The missed doses have the potential to have caused serious injury, specifically the individual's anticonvulsant. It's also important for the provider to consider whether employee 1 followed internal policies and procedures. If not, this adds to the potential for neglect. Another med error. So after appropriately administering the correct meds to individual number 1, employee 1 failed to sign the MAR per the provider's internal policy and procedure. Would this need to be reported? in Chris as potential neglect? No. Even though it is a medication error, it is a documentation error of a medication, which does not appear to have the potential to cause serious injury. Now, one thing that the provider can consider in this case is whether or not there should be a violation for the unsigned document, but that would be something that is internal. And it should be documented, that procedure should be documented in the internal policy. So Ryan was verbally threatening a peer and was not responding to staff's verbal redirection. Ryan charged at the peer in an attempt to attack the peer when staff placed Ryan in a one-person standing hold. During the restraint, Ryan began to struggle and pull away from the staff in an effort to aggress towards the peer. Another staff responded, and both staff placed Ryan in a two-person seated restraint. Staff practiced verbal de-escalation, and after about 10 minutes, Ryan successfully de-escalated, contracted for safety, and agreed to take a walk with staff to continue to de-escalate. While on the walk, though, Ryan told staff that his shoulder hurt and felt that the staff pulled too hard on his arm while they were in the restraint. Does this need to be reported in Chris? Yes. So Ryan is making an allegation that he was harmed while in a restraint. As the restraint should not cause harm to individuals, you should always investigate to determine if the restraint was completed in compliance with your standards and your practices, and of course your behavior management program and policies. So let's see what's going on with Drew. Drew picked up a chair to throw at Jason, who was his staff. Jason dodged the chair and then placed Drew in a one-person standing restraint. Drew contracted for safety after about 12 minutes in the standing hold. During review of the incident and the restraint, Drew told Rachel, another staff, that he should not have thrown the chair and that he understood that Jason had to restrain him to protect himself and others because Drew was throwing objects that could have caused harm to many others. Does this need to be reported in Chris? No, it does not. Because Drew was placing himself and others at risk, Jason followed agency protocol and placed Drew in the least restrictive restraint in order to ensure the safety and welfare of others in the room. There were no allegations of Drew being injured, so therefore there does not appear to be any violations and does not need to be reported in Chris. Sarah and Julie were sitting in the living room watching television. Catherine, another housemate and Sarah's roommate, came in the living room with Sarah's sweater on. Sarah immediately told Catherine to take her sweater off, but Catherine responded, "No, it's my sweater." Sarah then jumped out of her chair and headed towards Catherine to retrieve her sweater. Jill, the staff person, got in between them to prevent the two individuals from making contact. Jill asked Catherine to remove the sweater so she could check the name on the tag, as the provider has a policy where all individuals label their clothing with their first name and last name, their first name and last initial. Does this need to be reported in Chris? It does not. Because there was no contact made with any person and the DSP appropriately intervened and immediately intervened from preventing any further escalation, there does not appear to be any violation here and no one was injured. Therefore, it does not need to be reported in Chris. So Joe has a history of bullying Ken. On this day, Ken was walking around upset with everyone in the home. Daryl, a staff person, asked Ken what was wrong, and Ken responded, "Joe punched me on my left arm, and now my left arm hurts." When Daryl examined Joe's left arm, he did find a large bruise on the outside of his bicep. DSP Daryl asked Ken, "When did this happen?" Ken responded, "While we were alone in back and you were cooking lunch." Ken was transported to the ER for an x ray of his arm. The doctor reported it was negative for a fracture, however, it was bruised badly. There is a protocol in place to keep Joe and Ken separated due to Joe's history of bullying Ken. Does this need to be reported in Chris? Yes, absolutely it does. The staff did not follow the protocol, the written, documented protocol to keep Joe and Ken separated. And they were needing to be separated due to a history of bullying. So, therefore, there was potential for an escalated peer to peer incident, which falls under neglect due to no supervision. So while at Happy Camper Day program, staff number one, a nurse, discovered a sore on individual number one's right foot that appeared to be infected. Individual number one was taken to urgent care and there diagnosed with cellulitis. The doctor noted that the sore could be several days old. Does this need to be reported in Chris? Yes. An open wound that appears infected is a potentially serious injury requiring medical attention. Although we don't know the factors that contributed to the sore, that's a result of neglect. So the provider would need to investigate to determine if any potential neglect may have contributed to the injury. Providers should enter any incident that they investigate as potential neglect into the CRIS system for accurate and consistent data processing statewide. In this case, the fact that the doctor noted the sore could have been several days old is additional justification for investigation. So lastly, we just want to talk about some examples of complaints involving and not involving abuse and neglect. So if an individual states they were told they were being discharged from psychosocial rehab and would like to file a complaint due to not wanting to leave the program, when asked why they are being discharged, they state because they were told they met their goals. Would this be something that would be reported into Chris? Yes, a complaint should not be filed due to no complaint of discrimination or other potential human rights violations. The individual may be directed to the licensing complaint process at the address that is here on your screen to determine if the provider was following their discharge policy. So an individual states they do not agree with their Suboxone dosing schedule at the substance abuse clinic, stating they need more than what is being given, and that they're being tapered too soon. Again, no complaint would be filed due to this being the provider's policy, and there being a medical decision that was made by the treating physician. An individual states the staff member in the group home disabled her motorized wheelchair and, quote, parked her in the corner of the hallway facing the wall due to her behaviors. This would be entered in Chris and investigated as abuse as improper usage of seclusion, and may also be investigated as psychological abuse using the other category in CRIS. And again, the other category is something that is very rarely used, and if in fact it does need to be used, that would require a conversation with the assigned advocate or your assigned regional advocate. So finally, some reminders and tips. So for general questions about what should or should not be reported into CRIS, you want to contact your assigned regional advocate. However, in doing this, remember that you are mandated by the human rights regulations to report allegations of abuse and neglect within 24 hours and complaints of violations against an individual's assured rights at least by the next business day. So you want to be mindful of those reporting time frames while you are attempting to get in touch with the assigned OHR representative. If there are issues with CRIS login or Delta access, then you can certainly email deltaprod@dbhds.virginia.gov. Again, we recommend emailing as it is the easiest way, quickest way to get in contact with Delta Production, and this also provides you a paper trail of any requests that you may make. Remember that CRIS will time out after 15 minutes. This is a security feature. If you have not saved your work or any changes, they will be lost. We encourage you to keep track of the data that you put into CRIS, keep track in a Word document, and then you'll be able to copy and paste that information into CRIS. Make sure that you are always clicking save, and make sure that you are looking for the record is saved script that will be at the bottom and top of the page. If you do not see the record is saved, an error message will occur. You'll simply just need to review and fix that error, click save again, and then move on once you've seen the record is saved. CRIS entries are to be made again for the victim, not the aggressor. For peer-to-peer incidents, the victim is the individual assaulted. Complaints, including those involving abuse and neglect, are closed only by the human rights advocate. Thank you for joining us here. And on behalf of the Office of Human Rights, my colleagues and my peers, we appreciate all of the hard work that you do in providing services to the individuals in your care.